as they ran to the forest, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Olivia felt the panic rise in her chest. Every step she took seemed to take them deeper into the shadows, deeper into the grasp of the whispering woods. The landscape around them shifted unnaturally, as though the trees were closing in on them, leaning closer with each passing moment. The whispers were back, but now they were more than just soft murmurs. They were distinct, urgent, like a chorus of voices calling their names. "Olivia!" Jake's voice trembled. "Olivia, we have to get out of here. Now!" They pushed forward, but it felt as though the very air was thickening, the ground beneath them growing uneven, making it harder and harder to move. Every time Olivia looked over her shoulder, she saw nothing but the blackness of the woods closing in on them. Suddenly, Olivia tripped over a root hidden beneath the foliage and fell to the ground, scraping her palms on the rough, wet soil. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked up, trying to catch her breath. The air around her felt like it was pressing down, crushing her ribs. The whispers, those voices, seemed to grow louder, and they were now unmistakably calling her name. "Olivia!" A shadow flitted at the corner of her vision. She whipped her head around, eyes wide, but saw nothing. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. "Did you see that?" she gasped, her voice thin and strained. Jake, who had been pulling at her arm, stopped and turned toward her, his face pale. He looked over his shoulder, eyes wide with terror, but there was nothing behind them, just the trees. Still silent. "Stop messing around." Emily's voice came from behind them, startling both of them. "We need to keep moving." Olivia and Jake froze, staring at each other in confusion. "Emily, is that you?" Olivia called out, her voice shaking. But the Emily who stood there was not the Emily they knew. This figure had her face, but the expression was wrong. Empty, hollow, as though her soul had been drained. The figure smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was cold, terrifying. "Come with me," the figure whispered, and her voice sounded nothing like Emily's. It was distorted, hollow, like the echo of someone long dead. "No!" Jake shouted, his voice high-pitched with panic, pulling Olivia away. But the moment he turned around to run, the figure of Emily was gone. In her place stood a shadowy silhouette, tall and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long. The shape loomed over them, its features hidden in the darkness, and Olivia's blood ran cold. The whispers rose again, louder, more frantic this time. The air thickened, making it almost impossible to breathe. Jake tugged Olivia away, his grip tight around her wrist. "We have to keep moving. We can't stay here." The two of them ran, but it felt like the woods had transformed into a maze, each path winding them deeper into the heart of forest. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches scraping together like the skeletal fingers of some unseen force. The more they ran, the less it seemed like they were making any progress. Every time they turned, the trees looked the same, dark, twisted, and looming. "Where are we?" Olivia gasped, her voice hoarse as her legs began to tire. "This doesn't make any sense." Jake didn't answer. His eyes were wide with fear, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting something to leap from the shadows. "It's not real," he muttered to himself. "It's just in our heads. It has to be." But even as he said the words, Olivia knew he didn't believe them. The forest had a way of making you doubt everything you knew. Your senses, your thoughts, your very sanity. They reached a clearing, and at first, it seemed like an oasis of light. The trees had receded slightly, allowing the moonlight to spill through the branches, casting an ethereal glow over the grass. But there was something wrong about it. The air felt colder here, and the whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so deep that it hurt. "This isn't right," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake stepped forward into the clearing, looking around as if searching for something. The ground was uneven, the grass sparse in some areas and thick in others. And then Olivia noticed it, something strange and unsettling. In the center of the clearing, there was a large stone half buried in the earth. It wasn't a rock, though it was something else. It was too smooth, too symmetrical, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Jake seemed to notice it too. He knelt beside it, his fingers brushing against the surface, and then his face twisted in confusion. "Olivia, this isn't normal," he said quietly, his voice low and tense. "This stone, it's not like anything I've seen." Olivia took a step closer, tried to see what Jake was looking at. The stone had strange carvings on it, symbols that twisted and turned on themselves, their meaning lost time. And the closer she got, the more her skin crawled. It was as if the stone was drawing her in, pulling her toward it. She reached out, her fingers grazing the cold stone, and immediately felt a jolt of energy surge through her body. The ground trembled beneath her, and she staggered back, her heart racing. "What the hell is happening?" Jake cried, pulling her away from the stone. But the moment they turned to leave, they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. At the edge of the clearing stood another figure. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was Emily, but her face was twisted with an expression of rage and terror, her eyes wide and glassy, as though she was staring through them, not at them. "Help me," the figure whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. "Help me before it's too late." The figure started to move toward them, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though something else was controlling her body. The whispers returned, louder than ever, rising up around them, echoing from every corner of the forest. "Run!" Jake screamed, but it was already too late. The ground beneath them cracked open, and from the depths of the earth, a dark, writhing mass began to emerge. It was an ancient force, one that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The shadows seemed to thicken, coiling like tendrils around them, and the forest itself seemed to come alive, its branches reaching out to snatch them up. The figure of Emily dissolved into the darkness, her scream swallowed by the forest. Olivia turned to run, but the shadows closed in on her, pulling her down into the earth. The whispers surrounded her, their voices now screaming in a language she could not understand. And then everything went dark. The darkness swallowed Olivia whole, as if the forest had become a living nightmare, an endless void that consumed everything in its path. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet, nor could she see anything but the thick blackness that seemed to wrap itself around her like a suffocating blanket. The air was stale, heavy with the stench of decay, and the silence was unbearable. She gasped for breath, her lungs burning as she struggled to move, but her body refused to obey. Every time she tried to move, the darkness seemed to push her back, as if it was rejecting her presence. The whispers, those maddening whispers, returned, louder, sharper, like a chorus of voices speaking in tongues. They didn't just fill the air, they invaded her mind, clawing at the edges of her thoughts, demanding her attention, urging her to listen. "Olivia," the voice was familiar, yet distant. It was Emily's voice, distorted, hollow, as if coming from a faraway place. The voice was a warning, a plea, but it was twisted, as though something had changed in Emily, something dark and malevolent. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she wasn't just in a forest anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere that defied logic, a place beyond the boundaries of reality. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of what was happening. But there was no answer. The shadows pressed in tighter, and she felt herself being dragged further into the abyss. The whispers grew louder, then stopped abruptly, as if the darkness was waiting for something. And then she saw it, a flicker of light, just a tiny glimmer, but it was enough to make her heart leap in her chest. Olivia staggered toward it, desperate to find something, anything, that would help her make sense of this nightmare. As she moved closer, the light grew brighter, revealing the jagged outline of a stone structure. It was like an altar, ancient and covered in moss, its surface cracked and weathered by time. The air around it felt thick, oppressive, as though the very earth was holding its breath. In the center of the altar, there was a small, dark pool. The water shimmered with an eerie, unnatural glow, its surface rippling despite the lack of any apparent movement. Olivia felt an overwhelming pull toward it, as if the pool was calling to her, beckoning her closer. She approached slowly, her feet dragging across the cold, wet stone. When she reached the edge, she peered down into the water, her reflection distorted and blurred. But it wasn't just a reflection that stared back at her. There was something else, something dark and twisted, lurking beneath the surface. The eyes were glowing, bright, unblinking, filled with an ancient, malevolent hunger. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time so close it sent a shiver down her spine. It was Emily, but it wasn't. It was something else. Something far worse. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the water, grasping Olivia's wrist with a cold, iron grip. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the silence around her. The hand pulled her toward the pool, dragging her toward the dark depth below. Her body fought against it, but the grip tightened, unyielding, as if the very force of the darkness had a hold on her. She tried to scream again, to fight, but her strength was fading. The shadows were closing in around her, and the light from the altar seemed to dim. Just as she thought she was about to be pulled under, a loud crash echoed through the void. The ground beneath her feet shook, and the hand released its grip. Olivia stumbled backward, gasping for air, her heart racing in her chest. She looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but all she saw was the same suffocating darkness. And then, another figure. It was Jake. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He stood just a few feet away from her, his body trembling, as if he were struggling to stay upright. "Olivia?" His voice was faint, distant, as if he, too, were trapped in this place. "We have to get out of here. This isn't real. We can't stay here." Olivia didn't respond at first. She didn't know how to. Her mind was reeling from the horrors she had just experienced. But then she nodded, her body moving on instinct. "How do we get out?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Jake didn't answer. He just stared at her, his eyes dark and filled with dread. "I don't know," he whispered, "but we have to try. We can't stay here. We can't let it take us." As he spoke, the darkness seemed to respond, swirling around them like a storm. The shadows shifted and writhed, forming shapes, twisted, grotesque forms that lurked just beyond the edge of vision. Olivia couldn't make them out clearly, but she could feel their presence, pressing in on her, surrounding her. "Run!" Jake shouted suddenly, his voice breaking to the terror that was clouding Olivia's mind. Without thinking, she grabbed his arm and they bolted, running as fast as they could, the dark figures closing behind them. The forest, or whatever it was, seemed to shift around them, the trees warping and changing with every step. No matter how fast they ran, it felt like they were getting nowhere, like the woods were pulling them back in. The whispers returned, now louder than ever, crashing into their ears, overwhelming their senses. They couldn't hear each other over the din, couldn't even tell if they were still running in the same direction. The shadows were all around them now, surrounding them like a living nightmare. And then, just when Olivia thought they were done for her, she saw something. A door. It was small and unassuming, just a wooden door embedded in the side of a massive tree, half covered in moss. The wood was warped, old, and weathered, but there was something about it that seemed familiar. She didn't know why, but she felt an instinctive pull toward it. Without thinking, she reached for the handle and pushed it open. Beyond the door was nothingness, a vast, empty void that seemed to stretch on forever. The door was her only way out, their only chance for escape. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Jake. His face was pale with fear, but there was a look of determination in his eyes. "Let's go," he urged, grabbing her arm and pulling her through. They stepped through the door, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, everything went silent. The forest, the whispers, the shadows, it all faded away. The air was still, the ground solid beneath their feet. Olivia blinked, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was like they had stepped into a completely different world, one where time didn't exist. But then, as she turned to look at Jake, her stomach twisted in terror. The door behind them slammed shut with an echoing thud, and in the distance, she saw it. The thing that had been hunting them all along. It wasn't a creature, not really. It was a forest itself, alive, sentient, and hungering for them. The darkness was still there, waiting for its next victim. It was now that Olivia realized the truth. No one who enters the Whispering Woods ever leaves. Not really. They were trapped. The door slammed shut behind them, and Olivia stumbled back, her body trembling as she spun around to face Jake. The moment they crossed through, it felt as though the weight of the forest had been lifted. But the cold dread that clung to her heart told her it was not over. The air around them was still, eerily silent, and the ground beneath them was solid and unyielding. But the tension in her chest only grew with each passing second. Olivia scanned the surroundings. The place they had stepped into was unfamiliar, surreal. It wasn't a forest anymore, nor did it resemble any place she had ever seen. The sky above them was a sickly shade of gray, like a storm was just about to break. But it never did. The trees, if you could call them that, seemed ancient, gnarled and twisted. Their bark stretched like cracks in old porcelain. The shapes around them felt wrong, unnatural. Nothing made sense. The world felt as if it were suspended in a liminal space, neither fully real nor completely imagined. Jake was standing beside her now, his face pale, eyes wide with a kind of disbelief. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling with fear. Olivia couldn't answer. She didn't know. She didn't want to know. All she could hear was the echo of the whisper still lingering in her ears, faint but insistent. They were not gone, just muted, as if waiting for the right moment to rise again. "We have to find a way out," Jake said suddenly, his voice laced with urgency. This is wrong. We need to." But his words were cut off as a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. The trees trembled, their branches swaying unnaturally, and the distant sky seemed to darken even further. A sharp, cold wind swept through the space, carried with the faintest sound, like the rustle of something unseen, something vast, something ancient. Olivia felt her breath catch in her throat as she turned, half expecting to see the same dark figures from the woods closing in on them. But there was nothing. "Where are we?" Olivia whispered, more to herself than to Jake. Jake's eyes darted nervously around, his hand gripping hers tightly. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "But whatever's here, it wants us. We need to keep moving." Before Olivia could respond, a sound echoed through the air, a high-pitched screech that sliced through the silence like a knife. It was a shrill, desperate sound that made her blood run cold. Her eyes shot to the horizon, and there in the distance she saw it, a figure. It was hard to make out at first, just a silhouette in the darkening world. But as it drew closer, Olivia's stomach twisted. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. Her figure was hunched, her body elongated and grotesque, like a distorted reflection of a person. Her arms were unnaturally long, her fingers curling into claws that seemed to scrape against the ground with every step. Her face was what froze Olivia's heart. It wasn't a face at all, really, just hollow, empty sockets where eyes should have been. And from within those dark hollows, black smoke poured out, swirling and writhing like something alive. It was as if the woman was made entirely of darkness, her very existence an abomination against nature. Olivia stepped back, but Jake was already pulling her in the opposite direction, away from the figure. "Move!" he hissed, his voice raw. "We have to go now." They ran, their feet pounding against the strange, soft earth beneath them. The wind howled, carrying with it that same eerie screeching sound from behind them. It was as if the world itself was hunting them, chasing them, unwilling to let them escape. But no matter how fast they ran, the darkness never let up. The woman, or whatever she was, seemed to be gaining on them, her screech growing louder with each step. Olivia's heart was racing now, her legs burning with exhaustion. She could feel the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on her, the twisted branches of the trees reaching out as though they were alive, as though they wanted to ensnare them. Jake glanced back, his face contorted in terror. "It's too fast. We can't outrun it." Olivia didn't respond. She couldn't. She was too focused on the path ahead, trying to ignore the thudding in her chest and the growing dread that wrapped itself around her heart. She couldn't look back. If she did, she feared she would see something far worse than the monstrous figure trailing them. The air grew colder, and the earth beneath them seemed to shift, as though they were walking on the edge of reality itself. The sound of the world around them started to warp, becoming distorted, as though they were hearing them from far away. The wind carried whispers, but these were not the same whispers they had heard in the woods. These were darker, older, more malevolent. They hissed in languages that twisted Olivia's mind, threatening to tear her apart from the inside out. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, they came to a stop. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the path, blocking their way, her elongated arms outstretched, her hollow eyes staring into them. The smoke billowed from her sockets like an oily mist, suffocating the air, making it hard to breathe. Her mouth open in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "Why are you running?" the figure asked, her voice distorted, broken, as if it came from the very depths of the earth. The sound reverberated in Olivia's skull, like it was being whispered directly into her mind. Olivia froze. The words didn't make sense. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But there it was, standing before them. This creature from some forgotten nightmare, waiting for them to make their next move. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, his voice breaking as he held up his hands, trying to ward off the thing before them. But it didn't move. It didn't even flinch. It simply stood there, its hollow gaze never leaving them. Olivia's breath quickened. This wasn't just a creature. It was something else, something tied to this place, something older than time itself. It wasn't bound by the laws of nature. It didn't play by any rules. It wanted them. It wanted to pull them into the same abyss that had claimed Emily, that had claimed so many before them. The realization hit Olivia like a bolt of lightning. The whispering woods, the darkness, the creatures, they were all part of something bigger, something ancient, something far older than they could ever understand. "Please," Olivia gasped, her voice breaking. "Please let us go." The figure tilted its head, and the smoke pouring from its hollow eyes thickened, swirling like a storm. For a moment, Olivia thought she saw something, someone behind the figure, a glimpse of a face, a memory. "Emily, no one leaves," the creature whispered, and its voice echoed in every corner of her mind. "Not once you've entered." And then it moved. The ground beneath Olivia's feet cracked open, and the figure surged toward them, faster than anything human could be. The world around her spun, reality twisting, and she felt herself being pulled backward into the darkness. Everything went black. The darkness closed in around Olivia like a suffocating blanket, pressing down on her chest, crushing her with its weight. She gasped for air, but none came. Her lungs burned, her body trembling uncontrollably. Every instinct in her told her to fight, to claw her way back to the light. But it was as if she were trapped in a dream, a nightmare that refused to release its grip. The last thing she remembered was the creature's shadow engulfing her, the world unraveling as it pulled her deeper into the abyss. And now, she wasn't sure where she was. The very fabric of reality felt like it had shredded, and she was suspended somewhere in between, as if no time or space existed anymore. There was only the consuming dark, the silence, and the whispers. Olivia, her name echoed again, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. She tried to move, to call out, but her voice felt foreign, distant. She tried to open her eyes, but the weight of the darkness pressed on them like a vice, refusing to let her see. "Help me!" The voice, twisted and distorted, came from all directions, and Olivia realized with a shock that it was not just a creature whispering. It was something far worse. It was the voice of the forest itself, of the very darkness that had trapped her and all the others who had wandered too deep into the whispering woods. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The forest, it was alive. The creatures, the figures, the horrors they had encountered, they weren't just manifestations of their fears. They were the embodiment of the forest's ancient power, its insatiable hunger. It had been waiting for them, pulling them in, feeding on their terror. She had walked right into its trap. Suddenly, there was a shift. The oppressive weight of the darkness seemed to loosen, and Olivia felt her body jerk, as though someone or something was pulling her through the air. The whisper began to fade, replaced by an eerie, unsettling stillness. And then she felt something solid beneath her feet again. She opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light. She was back in the forest. No, not the forest. This place was different. The trees were twisted in grotesque, unnatural shapes. Long, gnarled limbs stretched out in every direction, like the skeletal arms of a giant. The ground was cracked and uneven, and the air smelled thick and rancid. It was as though she'd been dropped into a corrupted, decayed version of the world they had once known. The sky overhead was a sickly green, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns, like a storm that could never quite decide whether to break or not. Olivia's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to her feet, the faintest sliver of hope rising within her. Maybe she had escaped. Maybe she had found a way out. But then she saw them. At first, it was just a flicker in her peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the twisted trees. But then they emerged fully into view, a group of figures, all of them shrouded in darkness. Their eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, glowing like embers in the distance, fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. They weren't human, but something far worse. Their forms flickered, constantly shifting between different shapes. Humanoid one moment, monstrous the next. They were the spirits of the forest, the souls of the lost, those who had wandered too deep into the whispering woods and never returned. Olivia tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, strangled by the overwhelming dread that washed over her. Her legs felt weak, and her vision swam as the figures closed in on her, their glowing eyes never leaving hers. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. You should never have come. You belong to the woods now. You are ours. The words twisted in her mind, swirling around her like a storm of shadows. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She wanted to scream, to fight, but there was no energy left in her. It felt like the very air around her was draining her life force, leaving her weak, paralyzed. The figures reached out toward her, their long, twisted arms stretching unnaturally far, their fingers curling into claws. One of them, its face obscured by a mass of shifting shadows, stepped closer. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, its voice raspy and cold. You've seen the truth now. Olivia's heart skipped a beat as she realized what it meant. She hadn't escaped. This wasn't some alternate world. This was the heart of the Whispering Woods, the very source of its power, and she was trapped here forever, with no hope of escape. The forest had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before her. Jake, the thought shot through her mind like a bullet, a burst of panic rising in her chest. She whipped her head around, frantic, searching for any sign of him. But there was nothing. The figures moved closer, their cold presence suffocating her, but her mind was locked on one thought. Jake had to be here somewhere. He couldn't be gone. He couldn't be lost too. Where is he? She thought, the panic rising, twisting in her gut. But there was no answer. The whispering, the dark figures, the oppressive silence, all of it swallowed her thoughts, one by one. Then a noise, a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Olivia! Her heart leapt in her chest. It was Jake's voice. Jake? She cried out, her voice weak but desperate. She stumbled forward, her body shaking as she fought to move through the heavy air, her legs barely holding her up. Olivia! She turned toward the voice, pushing through the swirling shadows. Her vision was blurry, her head spinning, but she saw him, Jake, standing at the edge of the clearing, his figure barely visible in the gloom. He was calling to her, his face twisted in fear, his eyes frantic. Jake! Olivia cried, pushing herself toward him, her feet finally finding their strength again. I'm coming! But as she neared him, the shadows reached out, curling around her, pulling her back. No! She screamed, fighting against the pull. But it was useless. The darkness had her again. The figures closed in, their hands grabbing at her, holding her in place. And then, the final twist. Jake wasn't moving. He wasn't even looking at her. He was staring into the distance, his face frozen in terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was not trapped, like Olivia. He was something else, something darker. Behind him, a figure emerged in the shadows, something vast, towering, and ancient. It was a true master of the Whispering Woods, the thing that had been lurking in the background, watching them, waiting. And as it stepped forward, Jake's eyes grew wide with recognition, and then with understanding. The truth was too much to bear. Jake turned, and Olivia saw it. He had become one of them. He was now another spirit of the woods, a lost soul bound to this place forever. Olivia screamed his name, but it was too late. He had been consumed by the darkness, and now she was alone, the last living soul in this twisted nightmare. And the Whispering Woods would never let her go. The final moments felt like an eternity to Olivia. Time itself had lost all meaning, stretched and contorted by the oppressive presence of the Whispering Woods, the unrelenting grip of the darkness. The figure that had consumed Jake was towering now, its shadow cast over her like an inescapable abyss. There was no escape, no hope, only the crushing realization that this forest, this nightmare, was where she would remain forever. Olivia's legs trembled beneath her as the vast, dark figure loomed closer. The whispers had stopped, in their place. There was only a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The ground beneath her feet cracked and shifted, as if the forest itself was alive, feeding off the terror that radiated from her. She was powerless. Jake. The name echoed in her mind like a distant prayer, but it was only a faint echo now, slipping through her fingers like sand. The thing that had taken Jake was beyond comprehension, an ancient horror that had existed long before human memory. Its form was no longer something she could describe as a creature. It was a shifting mass of shadow and decay, an abomination that seemed to distort the very reality around it. As it moved, the air thickened. The ground quivered beneath its weight. Its eyes, glowing a sickly green, bored into her, and the cold, insidious whispers returned, this time clear and inescapable. You will never leave. You are ours. All who enter belong to us. Olivia's heart pounded as she looked desperately around for any means of escape, but there was nothing. The world around her was bending, contorting into grotesque shapes, like a nightmare unfolding in real time. The twisted trees and gnarled branches loomed overhead like skeletal hands reaching for her, their dark limbs closing in. She felt like she was drowning in the suffocating presence of it all, her mind reeling from the horror. But then, something stirred deep within her, a spark, a flicker of defiance. She couldn't die here, couldn't surrender to the darkness without a fight. She had to try. In that moment of desperation, something changed. The ground trembled again, and Olivia felt a shift in the atmosphere, like the woods themselves were beginning to react to her. She felt a tug, deep in the pit of her stomach, pulling her toward something. She didn't understand it at first, but then she saw it. In the distance, almost impossible to spot through the blinding darkness, there was a faint glow, the same kind of light that had called to her before, when she had entered the Whispering Woods in search of Emily. The light flickered like a beacon, casting a soft radiance through the crushing blackness. It was a hope. Without thinking, Olivia forced herself into motion. She didn't know what it was, but it had to be her way out. She pushed against the tendrils of darkness that wrapped around her ankles, forcing herself forward through the suffocating air. But as she moved, the monstrous figure, the ancient horror that had consumed Jake, shifted. Its enormous presence blocked her path, its distorted face twisting in an expression that might have been a sneer. You cannot escape, it whispered, its voice like the wind through rotting trees. You are already ours. We own you. Olivia's chest constricted, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness closed in tighter, and she felt her legs weakening, the ground beneath her becoming heavier, like the very earth was trying to swallow her whole. But the light, so faint, so distant, burned brighter. She could feel it pulling her, coaxing her forward. With a final, desperate cry, Olivia pushed past the shadows that held her, forcing herself forward. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature's voice grew louder, more insistent, its cold presence pressing in from all sides. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. Her feet moved faster, and as she neared the light, the shadows seemed to pull back, retreating into darkness as if they feared it. Olivia's heart fluttered with the smallest glimmer of hope. Could it be? Was the light truly the key? Or was it just another illusion? She didn't care. She couldn't care. She reached the light just as the ground beneath her cracked open. It was no longer the forest. The air was clearer, the space less oppressive. The twisted trees faded into the distance, the oppressive weight of the woods lifting. But there was something different about the space she now stood in. It was like being on the edge of two worlds, one foot in the nightmare and the other just a breath away from freedom. The light flared brightly, and Olivia squinted, her heart hammering. The shadows, the creatures, the dark figures, were gone. There was only the light, a soft, soothing radiance that felt like the calm after storm. Olivia? She turned quickly, her pulse racing, and there he was, Jake. But this time he was different. His face was no longer twisted in terror. There was no sign of the grotesque, shadowy figure that had consumed him. He was whole again, his eyes soft, almost apologetic. "Jake!" Olivia breathed, barely believing what she was seeing. "But how?" "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, taking a tentative step toward her. "I'm sorry for everything, for what happened, for what I became." Olivia stared at him, her chest tight. The whispers, the shadows, the horrors they had witnessed. It all felt so far away now, like a bad dream she was finally waking from. Jake smiled faintly. "You made it, Olivia. You escaped." She looked around at the light, the serene calm that surrounded them. The cold grip of the whispering woods seemed like a distant memory. It was hard to believe, but it was real. She was free. They were free. And then, as she felt herself let out a shaky breath, she heard something. The whispers, faint, distant, but unmistakable. "You cannot escape, not truly." Olivia's heart stopped, the dread returning in full force. The light flickered, just for a moment, and in the darkness beyond the light, she could see them, the figures of the lost souls, their eyes glowing in the shadows. They were still there, waiting, watching. Jake's face paled, and he took a step back, his expression clouded with fear. "Olivia, we—" And then, as quickly as it had come, the light went out. The darkness swallowed them whole. The light had vanished, leaving only the cold, suffocating grip of darkness. Olivia's pulse thundered in her ears as she reached for Jake, her hand shaking uncontrollably. Her heart raced, every instinct telling her to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness stretched endlessly around them, oppressive and thick. The whispers were louder now, filling her mind with 1,000 voices, each one more maddening than the last. "You can never leave. You are ours. You belong here now." Jake's grip on her hand tightened, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. He looked around frantically, his breath shallow, as if the very air itself was poisoning him. He glanced back at Olivia, his expression tormented. "Olivia, we shouldn't have made it this far. This place, it's too much for anyone to survive." Olivia shook her head, trying to ignore the overwhelming weight of the darkness around them. "No, Jake, we have to keep moving. We can't give up." But even as she spoke the words, her own doubt crept in. Had they truly escaped? Or had the forest merely lured them into a deeper, more terrifying part of its existence? Was there a way out? Or were they doomed to remain here forever, trapped in the heart of the whispering woods? A chill ran down Olivia's spine as a low, guttural laugh echoed from the shadows around them. It wasn't just one voice, but many, layered upon one another, deformed, unnatural. The laugh reverberated through the space, causing the very air to quiver. "Not even the light can save you," the voice crooned, slithering through the darkness. "You belong to the forest now. You always have." The words hit Olivia like a punch to the stomach. The realization, no, the fear sunk deeper into her bones. She had tried to escape. She had tried to fight. But what if she was wrong? What if the Whispering Woods had never been a place she could leave? The ground beneath their feet trembled, and Olivia's breath caught in her throat as the world around them began to distort, bending in unnatural angles. The trees twisted and writhed, their bark cracking open like a wound, revealing the twisted, gnarled forms of monstrous roots beneath. The air became thick, charged with electric energy, a malevolent force that seemed to stretch out, trying to envelop them. And then, through the swirling fog, she saw it, a figure, tall and looming, standing in the distance. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a woman. It was something else entirely. Its form was a mass of shadows, swirling like smoke, with hollow eyes staring out from the darkness. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, curling and unfurling like tentacles, reaching toward them. The thing radiated an ancient malevolence, a presence so powerful that Olivia's heart skipped a beat in terror. It was the source, the master of the Whispering Woods. "No!" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "It's here. It's come for us." The thing took a step forward, its movement slow but deliberate. The ground shook with each of its steps. Olivia felt her knees weaken, her body freezing in place. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it, even though every fiber of her being screamed for her to look away, to run. But there was no running. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one sharp and glistening. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices swirling around them, each one more desperate and filled with agony than the last. Olivia felt the weight of every soul that had been claimed by this place pressing down on her, suffocating her. "You are one of us now. You cannot fight it. You will never leave." The creature's eyes gleamed with an ancient hunger, its voice deep and resonant as it spoke directly into Olivia's mind. "Do you feel it, little one? The call of the forest? The pull of the roots beneath your feet? You cannot escape. You never could." Olivia shook her head, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words stuck in her throat. There was no way out. Jake's grip on her hand faltered, and he turned to her with a look of despair in his eyes. "Olivia, I don't know what to do. We're not going to make it, are we?" Olivia opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? She didn't have the answers. She didn't know how to escape this place. All she knew was that whatever this creature was, whatever the Whispering Woods were, they were far beyond her understanding. She couldn't fight them. But then something shifted. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, as if the world itself were reacting to their desperation. Olivia blinked, and for a moment, the darkness seemed to recede just slightly. The whispers softened, replaced by a new, distant sound, a faint song, as delicate as a lullaby. The creature halted. Its glowing eyes flickered, and its form wavered, as if uncertain. Olivia's heart skipped a beat as she realized the source of the song. It was the same light, the same beacon that had called to her before. It was coming from somewhere deep within the forest. "Jake!" she whispered urgently, pulling at his hand. "There's a way out. We can still escape. We just have to follow the light." Jake's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, hope flickered across his face. He nodded, gripping her hand tighter. "If there's a chance, I'll follow you." They started to move, stumbling to the darkness, the whispers rising again, more insistent, more furious than before. The shadows seemed to follow them, closing in with each step they took toward the light. The creature, no longer content to remain in the shadows, began to shift, its limbs elongating, twisting like vines in pursuit. But Olivia's focus was fixed on the light. It pulsed in the distance, growing brighter with each step, casting an almost ethereal glow on the twisted trees that surrounded them. The wind began to pick up, a soft breeze that carried with it the sound of leaves rustling, as though the forest itself were urging them on. The creature's growl was deafening now, its massive form closing in. It was faster, its eyes burning with a furious hunger. The ground shook with each of its steps, as if the earth itself was responding to its power. "You cannot outrun us." But Olivia didn't stop. She couldn't. She wouldn't. They were getting closer. The light was nearly within reach. Just a few more steps, and they might... And then, suddenly, there was a sound. A sharp crack, like the breaking of a branch. Olivia glanced back just in time to see the creature lunge toward them, its twisted, monstrous limbs stretching out to claim them. Everything seemed to slow. In the brief moment before the creature reached them, Olivia did the only thing she could think to do. She shoved Jake forward with all her strength, sending him tumbling toward the light. "Go!" she screamed. "Go!" Jake turned, his face a mask of horror. Olivia. But the creature was already upon her. And in that final moment, as the darkness closed in once more, Olivia understood. The forest had never let her go, and now it never would. The world around Olivia collapsed into shadow, the air thick with the overwhelming presence of creature that had finally claimed her. The last thing she saw before the darkness overtook her was Jake's face, twisted in agony and disbelief, as he was forced forward by her desperate shove toward the light. Time seemed to stretch, contort, and break in that instant. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath sharp and shallow. The creature's cold, unnatural hands reached out, and she felt her body pulled into its grasp like a fly caught in a spider's web. The whispers grew deafening, their voices mixing with a hollow, bone-chilling growl of the creature, which wrapped around her, drowning out all other sound. You belong here. You will never escape. But just as her thoughts began to fray at the edges, a sharp, searing pain shot through her body, unlike anything she had ever felt before. It wasn't a physical pain. It was deeper, like something tearing at the very fabric of her being. She screamed, but no sound left her lips. The shadows were suffocating her, consuming her very essence. And then nothing. The world vanished, leaving her in a black void, suspended in an unfeeling expanse. For a long, infinite moment, Olivia was unsure whether she was alive or dead, lost to whatever realm the Whispering Woods had cast her into. But then the light returned. At first, it was nothing more than a faint shimmer in the distance, a soft pulse of warmth in the vast, empty darkness. The shadows seemed to recoil from it, swirling away like smoke in the wind. As the light grew brighter, Olivia felt something stir within her, something that had long been buried under the weight of fear and despair. It was hope. She didn't know how or why, but she felt herself pulled toward it. It wasn't a physical force. It was something deeper, an instinct, a yearning to live, to break free from whatever nightmarish prison she'd been thrown into. She stumbled forward, her feet barely touching the ground, and as she drew closer to the light, she saw something, or rather, someone, a figure, standing just beyond the glow. It was a man, but not like the creatures or shadows she had seen in the forest. This man was different. His face was clear, his eyes filled with a gentle, kind light. His presence was calming, almost reassuring, as though he were not of this world but something else entirely. "Olivia," the man said, his voice soft and soothing. "You've been through so much." Her body shook with exhaustion, but she tried to speak, tried to ask where she was, what was happening. But her mouth wouldn't move, the words trapped inside her. Instead, she looked at him, desperate for any kind of answer. The man smiled at her, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I know you're scared," he continued. "I know what the woods did to you, but this is not the end." Where am I?" she finally managed to ask, her voice cracking with the weight of everything she had just witnessed. "You are at the threshold," the man answered, his gaze distant now, as though looking into something far beyond her comprehension. "The Whispering Woods don't just trap bodies. They trap souls. But your soul is strong. Stronger than you know." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. "You mean I haven't lost myself? I haven't become one of them?" "No," the man said, his voice firm but gentle. "Not yet. Not unless you let them." Olivia felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. "But I was in the woods. The creature," she faltered, the memory of the monstrous being pulling her back into the darkness for a moment. "It said I would never escape, that I belonged to the woods." "The creature is a servant," the man explained, his tone tinged with sadness. "A servant of something much older, much darker. The Whispering Woods are not just a place. They are a prison built on fear, on suffering, on souls lost in the dark." Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "But how do I escape? How do I get out of here?" The man looked at her with eyes full of sorrow, his gaze lingering on her face for a long moment. "There is no simple escape," he said softly. "The woods will always pull at you. It is their nature. They feed on the weak, the lost, the desperate. But you are stronger than you think. You can break the cycle." Olivia's head spun with the weight of his words. "But Jake, what about Jake? He..." The man's expression darkened slightly, a shadow crossing his face. "Jake is lost, Olivia, but not beyond hope. He is still fighting. He can still be saved if you choose to fight for him." Olivia's heart clenched in her chest. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Jake is still out there, despite everything. Despite the darkness and the creature that had nearly consumed her, there was still a chance for him. But how? She whispered, barely able to hold back the tears. How do I save him? You must face the heart of the forest, the man said, his voice solemn. You must confront the creature, the darkness that controls it. Only then can you break free. Not just for yourself, but for Jake, too. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. I'll do it. I'll face whatever it takes. I won't let the woods take him. The man nodded, his expression resolute. The journey will not be easy. You will face your deepest fears. But you're not alone. The light will guide you. Remember, the darkness feeds on fear. If you can conquer it, you will win. The light around them grew brighter, pulsing with intensity that made Olivia squint. The man raised his hand, and suddenly, she was no longer standing in the void. She was back in the whispering woods. The forest had returned, but this time, it was different. The air was still thick with dread, but there was something else now, something that felt like strength, a flicker of light in the heart of the overwhelming darkness. The light is with you. The man's voice echoed in her mind. Follow it. It will lead you to the heart of the woods. There, you must make your choice. Olivia took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she would survive. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let the woods win. Not now. Not when Jake still had a chance. The light pulsed again, and she moved toward it, her eyes fixed on the distant glow. As she walked deeper into the forest, she could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet. The shadows seemed to recoil from the light, but they were still there, lurking just out of reach, waiting for her to falter. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, more frantic. You cannot defeat us. You belong to us. Give in. Let go. But Olivia kept walking, her hand clenched into a fist at her side. The light was still there, bright and unwavering, a beacon in the overwhelming dark. With each step she took, the whispers faded, the shadows pulling back just a little more. She had made her choice, and now she would see it through to the end. The deeper Olivia ventured into the whispering woods, the more the air seemed to thicken around her, as if the very atmosphere was alive, suffocating, and hungry. The trees twisted in grotesque shapes, their gnarled roots snaking across the forest floor like dark veins, pulsing with life. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of lost souls clawing for sanity. Their voices muffled but persistent. You cannot fight us. You will never escape. You belong here. But Olivia was resolute. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to keep moving toward the light. It beckoned her, now a glowing beacon ahead, growing stronger with every step she took. The path before her seemed to open up, leading her toward the center of the forest, the heart of the whispering woods. The shadows that had once seemed distant now pressing closer, like tendrils wrapping around her limbs, tightening with every stride. Olivia could feel the weight of the forest pushing down on her. It was as though it were trying to drag her back, to bury her beneath the layers of its eternal darkness. Give in Olivia. The voice was cold and familiar, its tone sweet and serpentine, like a lover's whispered promises in the dead of night. The same voice she had heard when the creature had first laid its hands on her, when it had pulled her into its clutches. The creature, the dark being that had consumed Jake, that had tormented her every step of the way. It was watching, waiting. But Olivia didn't falter. She pushed forward, her every step filled with determination. The light ahead flickered violently, casting long, stretching shadows that writhed as though alive. The path was narrowing now, leading her toward a clearing, the heart of the forest. There, she knew, she would find the source of it all. She stumbled into the clearing, her eyes wide as she took in the sight before her. The clearing was vast, more enormous than any space she had entered before. Towering trees formed a jagged ring around it, their branches stretching high into the black sky, blocking out the moon. The air was heavy, thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath her feet was slick with something dark and viscous. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, cracked and weathered by time, but unmistakably ancient. And standing before it, gazing at her with gleaming, predatory eyes, was the creature. It was no longer the twisted, shadowy figure she had seen before. It had shed its disguise, its true form revealed in its horrifying grandeur. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. Its skin was made of writhing, pulsating shadows, like the very fabric of night itself had been molded into its shape. Its face was a nightmare, a grotesque mass of jagged teeth, hollow eyes that glowed a sickly green, and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide as it opened with a growl. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she felt its cold gaze pierce through her, deeper than anything she had ever felt before. It was the thing that controlled the forest, the darkness that had fed on every soul foolish enough to wander into the whispering woods. "Olivia!" The creature's voice slid through the air like a dagger, sharp and insidious. "You came so far, but it's too late now." Its voice wrapped around her like chains, suffocating her will. Every part of her screamed to turn back, to flee, but she could not. She stood frozen in place, staring at the abomination before her. "You belong to me," the voice echoed, crawling into her mind, making her bones ache with cold. "No," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "No, I don't. You don't own me. I came here to end this." The creature let out a twisted laugh, its body shifting unnaturally as it took a step closer. "You cannot stop me. You never could." Olivia's heart pounded as she clutched her fists at her sides, fighting the overwhelming urge to give in to the darkness. She felt the force around her pressing in, suffocating, but she pushed back, the words from the man in the light echoing in her mind. "The light will guide you. If you can conquer fear, you can break the cycle." The whisper started again, louder now, frantic. "It's too late. You can't escape." But Olivia refused to listen. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another. Each step felt like it took every ounce of strength she had. The creature growled in frustration, its eyes flashing with fury as it surged forward, its limbs stretching to seize her. But Olivia was faster. The moment it lunged, she spun, her body moving on instinct, and ran toward the altar at the center of the clearing. The creature screamed behind her, its voice echoing like thunder. But she didn't stop. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. As she reached the altar, the ground beneath her feet cracked open, and a bright, blinding light erupted from the stone beneath her. The air vibrated with an unnatural hum, and the shadows around her began to writhe in agony, pulling away from the light as if they were being burned. Olivia raised her hands, her palms facing the light, and whispered a prayer, a desperate plea for strength. She didn't know where the words came from, but they spilled from her lips, urgent and raw. "Let me break free." The light flared, and for a moment, the clearing was bathed in blinding white. The creature let out a roar of agony, its form distorting, shifting violently as the light scorched it. Olivia could hear its tortured scream, but she didn't falter. She focused on the light, willing it to grow brighter, stronger. And then, silence. The light dimmed, and when Olivia opened her eyes, she saw that the creature was no longer standing before her. The clearing was empty, the shadows slowly receding into the distance. The air was still and quiet. The suffocating presence of the forest had vanished. But she knew this was not the end. The woods were still there. The darkness still lingered, waiting, patient, biding its time. Olivia took a deep breath, the weight of everything she had just endured heavy on her shoulders. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As she turned to leave the clearing, she heard a faint whisper in the air, almost too soft to hear. "You cannot escape." But this time, Olivia was ready. The light within her had grown stronger, and no matter how many times the forest called, no matter how many times it tried to drag her back, she would fight, because she had already chosen her path. The whispers lingered in the air long after the light had faded, but Olivia stood tall, her heart steady as she breathed in the quiet aftermath of the battle. For a fleeting moment, she thought she could hear the wind, the chirp of distant birds, the soft rustling of leaves, things that had been absent in the whispering woods for so long. The suffocating darkness seemed to have loosened its grip, but she knew better than to believe the woods had given up so easily. She turned her back to the altar, the ground beneath her feet still pulsing with faint energy. There was a feeling in the pit of her stomach, a warning, an instinct that told her she hadn't seen the last of the whispering woods. As she took her first step away from the clearing, the ground trembled, a low rumble that made her skin crawl. Not yet. The voice was faint, like a distant murmur, but Olivia knew it wasn't just in her mind. The creature, or whatever controlled the whispering woods, was not done with her. She was simply a tool in his eternal game, a pawn it had not yet fully broken. Her footsteps quickened as the forest around her began to twist once more. The trees groaned, their branches curling toward the sky like claws reaching for her, the shadows twisting and morphing as if the land itself was alive with hunger. The peace she had felt moments ago was slipping away, replaced by the creeping dread that had haunted her every step since she had first entered the woods. "You can never leave." The voice came again, louder now, sharper, angrier. She broke into a run, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs trembling with exhaustion, but she kept going. She couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when the threat was still looming. Not when Jake was still trapped somewhere in this nightmare. As she ran, the forest seemed to close in on her. The trees bent at odd angles, their limbs stretching toward her like skeletal hands, their shadows swallowing the path ahead. It felt as though the woods were alive with malice and with a hunger that would never be satisfied. And then she saw it. At first, it was a flicker in the corner of her vision, like a shadow passing between the trees. But when she turned her head, it was gone. Olivia stopped, her breath hitching, her heart racing. There, again, another flicker. She wasn't alone. Olivia's instinct screamed at her to run, but her curiosity, her need to understand what was happening, kept her rooted to the spot. She was being hunted. She knew that much. The whispering woods weren't finished with her, and whatever it was that lurked in the trees was coming for her. She could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her skin prickled, and she turned sharply, scanning the forest around her, but there was no sign of movement. The shadows were darker now, almost tangible, creeping toward her with every second that passed. She could hear them again, the whispers, 1,000 voices calling out to her from the depths of the trees. "You can't run from us. We own you. You belong to the woods." A shadow darted across her line of sight again, this time moving much faster, much closer. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, her eyes wide. Was it the creature? Was it the thing that controlled the forest? No, this was different. The figure stepped out from the shadows, tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs contorted in strange angles. It was humanoid, but not entirely. Its face was a blank canvas, its features hidden in shadow. Its body seemed to shimmer like a mirage, its edges flickering in and out of reality, making it impossible to fully focus on. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as the figure moved toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Olivia's mind raced. What is it? She didn't have time to ponder the question before it reached her. The figure stopped just inches away, and Olivia recoiled, her heart thudding in her chest. She tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand toward her, and the moment it touched her skin, a jolt of cold shot through her body. Pain. Not just physical pain, but an overwhelming sensation of loss, of something being torn from her, ripped away from the core of her being. She felt her connection to the world, to everything she had ever known, slipping away, fading like smoke. She gasped, trying to pull away, but the figure's grip tightened. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, flared to life, glowing with a deep, empty darkness. This is the true nature of the woods. The figure whispered, its voice both male and female, a chorus of many. It is not just a place. It is a force, a hunger, and now you are part of it. Olivia felt her knees buckle, the ground slipping from beneath her. The figure's cold, unnatural grip held her fast, and for the first time since her journey into the wood began, she felt a true sense of hopelessness. She was losing herself. Suddenly, a flash of light pierced the darkness, sharp and bright, like the light she had seen at the heart of the forest. A familiar presence surged through her, a warmth, a strength that seemed to pulse from deep within the earth. No! The word escaped her lips in a guttural cry, and in that moment, the light flared brighter, more powerful than ever before. The figure recoiled, its form flickering violently as the light pushed it back. The grip on her loosened, and for the first time since entering the forest, Olivia felt herself break free from the thing that had held her. The figure let out a screech, a horrible, banshee-like wail that seemed to shatter the very air around her. It stumbled backward, its body warping, flickering between reality and the abyss. The forest seemed to tremble with its rage, the trees groaning and cracking as though something massive was about to break free. "You cannot win," the figure hissed, its voice twisted with fury. "The woods will have you. All of you." But Olivia stood her ground, her hand raised toward the light, a force now building inside her. The light surged forward, and with one final push, the figure was torn apart, its form dissolving into smoke and shadows, its screams dying out as it was consumed by the very darkness it had once commanded. The forest fell silent. Olivia stood panting, her body trembling with the remnants of the fight. The light around her dimmed, leaving only the faintest glow, but it was enough to keep the shadows at bay. She wasn't free, not yet, but she had struck a blow. The whispering woods were powerful, but not invincible. The woods still whispered, still called to her, but she knew now that she had the strength to fight back. The forest was alive, but so was she, and she would keep fighting. The silence that followed the battle was eerie, a heavy stillness that pressed down on Olivia's chest, making every breath feel like it was drawn through a thick veil. The light that had once surged around her had dimmed, leaving only the faintest glow to guide her through the darkness. Yet the air still hummed with a subtle tension, the kind of silence that precedes something far worse. Something she wasn't prepared for. She had thought she had won, thought she had finally overcome the whispering woods, or at least driven back its horrors. But the more she stood there, surrounded by the towering trees that seemed to leer down at her, the more she realized the truth. The woods were far from done with her. As she took a step forward, the ground beneath her feet shifted. The very earth seemed to move, the roots of the trees twisting and stretching out like the fingers of some ancient creature, clawing at the air. The trees groaned, their trunks creaking as though they were waking from a long slumber, stretching their limbs toward the sky. And then the whispers returned. "You cannot leave. Not yet. Not when we still hunger." Olivia's stomach churned. The familiar, oppressive voice of the woods slid into her mind like a snake, its cold, slithering words wrapping around her thoughts, tightening with every passing second. "You cannot escape your fate. You belong to us." She tried to move, to push through the feeling of suffocating dread that surrounded her, but the forest seemed to close in around her, narrowing her path with each step. The trees bent closer, their branches now heavy with shadows, blocking out any remaining light. Olivia's pulse quickened, and her breath became shallow. There was something here, something worse than the creature she had faced, the true essence of the woods. She was not just up against the creatures, the shadows, the figures. She was up against the forest itself. The ground before her split open with a loud crack, as though some great force was awakening from deep within the earth. A dark, inky mist began to rise from the fissure, swirling around her feet like tendrils of smoke. The air grew cold, colder than it had ever been before, and she could feel the chills seep into her bones. Then from the mist, something emerged, a figure tall and thin, like a shadow of shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were savoring every second of fear that radiated from Olivia. Her heart skipped a beat as the figure's features began to materialize from the darkness, and she recognized it. It was a man. No, the thing she had seen at the heart of the forest before. The one who had spoken to her through the light, urging her to fight. But now, his face was twisted, his expression grotesque, as if the very essence of the woods had corrupted him. "Olivia!" The thing's voice was a soft, mocking whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves. "Did you really think you could leave?" Olivia's breath hitched, but she stood her ground. She had already faced so much, endured so many horrors. There was no turning back now. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice shaky but determined. The figure smiled, a slow, sinister curl of its lips that sent a cold shiver down her spine. "We don't want anything from you, Olivia," it said, its voice seeping into her very soul. "We want everything. You're not just a part of the woods. You are the woods now." The words rang in her ears like a death sentence. Olivia's heart raced, and her instinct screamed at her to run. But where could she go? The forest had already consumed everything around her. The trees had become grotesque extensions of the dark force that controlled this place, and the very ground beneath her feet felt alive with malice. The figure took a step forward, its movement fluid, like smoke swirling in the wind. "The whispering woods were never meant to be escaped," it continued. "They are eternal, and so are you." The darkness around her seemed to pulse with life, responding to the figure's words, to the curse that had been laid upon her. The woods were trying to claim her, to pull her into the very heart of the forest, to make her a part of it, just like the others who had fallen before her. Olivia shook her head, trying to push the fear away, to focus on the only thing that mattered, surviving. She couldn't let the woods win. Not now. Not when Jake was still out there, somewhere lost in the darkness. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but strong. "I won't become one of you. I won't let you win." The figure chuckled, the sound hollow and chilling. "You have already lost, Olivia. You just don't know it yet." Before she could react, the figure lunged forward, faster than she could comprehend, its cold hands reaching out to grasp her. The mist thickened around her, and in a flash, she was submerged in a cold, suffocating darkness, her body pulled into the very heart of the forest, deep into the place where even light dared not go. Olivia's vision blurred, and she felt herself falling, tumbling through a void, as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her senses became distorted, and she could no longer tell up from down, light from dark. All that surrounded her was a crushing weight of nothingness. The whispers grew louder again, a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. "You are ours. Join us. There is no escape." But in the distance, through the smothering blackness, Olivia saw something. Faint at first, like the glow of a dying star. The light she had seen before. The one that had guided her. The one she had clung to in her darkest moments. She reached for it, her hands trembling, her mind a whirl of fear and determination. "I won't give up," she thought. "I can't give up." The light flickered brighter, pushing back the shadows, the whispers fading, retreating into the deep recesses of the darkness. Olivia's heart surged with hope, and she willed herself toward the glow, toward the warmth it promised. She could feel it now, like a pulse, like something alive, something real. And then, in an instant, she was there. Her body slammed against the ground, the force knocking the breath from her lungs. But the light was all around her, swirling, wrapping her in its warmth, in its purity. The darkness shrieked, its howls echoing in her ears, but it was fading, retreating into the depths of the forest from which it came. For the first time, Olivia felt like she was truly free. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, her breath returning to normal, her heart slowly calming. The darkness was gone. The woods had released its grip on her, at least for now. She was no longer trapped. But even as she tried to catch her breath, even as she allowed herself a moment of peace, the weight of her reality settled back into place. The whispering woods were not gone. They were still out there, still waiting, still lurking in the shadows. And though the light had guided her once again, she knew it could only protect her for so long. As the light began to fade, Olivia pulled herself to her feet, dusting off her clothes. She didn't know where she was going or what was next, but one thing was certain, she couldn't stop now. The woods were still out there, and Jake was still lost. Olivia took a deep breath, and with one final glance at the fading light, she stepped forward into the unknown, the whispers of the woods still echoing in her mind. Olivia's breath still shuddered in the aftermath of the darkness, but her pulse was steadying, the overwhelming panic ebbing from her chest. The light, though fading, had not abandoned her completely. It lingered in her, a beacon of strength and hope, a reminder that she was not entirely lost. But the woods were never truly silent. The trees groaned, their limbs twitching, as though they were aware of her every movement. The silence was deafening. a quiet too unnatural to be comfortable. Olivia turned, scanning the shadow-drenched forest around her, a sense of unease creeping back into her veins. Even though she had fought the woods, struck a blow to its dark heart, she knew that this battle was far from over. She couldn't escape. Not yet. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow. Try to focus on the path ahead. The trees seemed to stretch farther, their trunks thickening, as if they were closing in on her. The very air felt heavier now, the oppressive atmosphere thicker with each step. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift subtly, as if the earth was alive and crawling beneath her soles. She had left the heart of the forest, but had it truly left her? The forest never lets go. The thought echoed in her mind, chilling her more than any physical presence ever could. The whispering woods were part of her now, intertwined in her blood, in her soul. It was as if she had been marked by the very essence of this cursed land. And then came the voices. They began low, so faint at first that Olivia thought they were just the wind, or perhaps the remnants of her exhaustion. But no, as she continued walking, the voices grew clearer, sharper. They were calling her name, their whispers curling around her like tendrils, drawing her attention. Olivia, her name was pulled from the air, a soft caress, followed by a darker hiss. Olivia, join us. Her pulse quickened, her body freezing, instinctively knowing that these were not the voices of people. No, they were the voices of the woods, souls trapped within, echoes of the forest's insatiable hunger. Her eyes darted nervously around her, searching for the source of the whispers, but there was nothing, just shadows and branches stretching long into the darkened sky. Olivia stepped back, her breath coming fast, and yet she forced herself to move forward. She couldn't afford to be swallowed by the dark again. We know you, Olivia. You cannot outrun us. The voices came in a chorus, sharp and insistent. Some were soft, like children calling for their mothers, while others were guttural, filled with rage and malice. All of them, however, were terrifyingly familiar, as though they were personal to her, an insidious reminder of the soul-crushing horror she had endured. You are one of us. You always have been. A frigid wind swept through the forest, and in its wake the darkness deepened, swirling around her, clouding her thoughts. The forest was alive, and it had begun to reclaim her, as though it had been biding its time, waiting for the moment she would slip. But Olivia could feel something stirring inside her, a stubborn resolve. She had not made it this far only to fall to the woods. No, she wasn't going to let it win. Not now. Not when Jake's face was still etched in her memory, lost in the web of shadows. She clenched her fists and pressed forward. Jake, she thought desperately. I will find you. Her heart thudded in her chest, and the whispers only grew louder, louder still. Her footsteps became quicker, more frantic, but it felt as if the trees were pushing in on her, growing closer with each step. The roots of the trees shot up from the ground, twisting and curling like claws, trying to trip her, to pull her into the depths of the earth. You cannot fight us. The voice came from all directions now, a roar that shook the air, a force so powerful it made her knees buckle. Olivia stumbled but caught herself, barely keeping her balance as she looked around. The mist had started to roll in again, creeping up her legs like a suffocating blanket. She could feel it now, a presence creeping behind her, its steps soft but deliberate. She wasn't alone. She turned quickly, her breath ragged in her chest. The shadows between the trees were shifting, and in that shift, something darker, something far more dangerous, began to take form. At first, it was just a silhouette, something massive and looming in the shadows. Then, like smoke from a fire, it began to solidify, its shape becoming sharper, more distinct. A creature, tall and impossibly thin, emerging from the forest itself. Its skin was like the bark of the trees, dark, rough, and twisted. Its limbs were stretched unnaturally long, its fingers clawed, and its eyes, those glowing, piercing eyes, burned with malevolent fire. The creature grinned, a grotesque, elongated smile that spread across its face like a crack in the earth. You think you can stop us, Olivia? The voice echoed in her mind, thick and venomous. You think you can break free? The creature took a step toward her, its movement so fluid and predatory that Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The air around it rippled with darkness, pulling in the very light she had been clinging to. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor, desperate to escape the thing that was chasing her. The woods seemed to move with her, the path never ending, the trees growing taller, thicker, the shadows deeper. The whispers continued, screaming at her, tried to pull her down into the soil, to drown her in the darkness. The creature was gaining on her. She could feel it. She could hear its breaths, deep, raspy, like the sound of cracking branches. And then came the sharp, bone-chilling screech of its claws on bark. Run, Olivia, run. Her lungs burned, her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. The path ahead was a blur, her vision clouded with terror. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. The mist thickened and the forest seemed to become a labyrinth of twisted branches and dark corners. There was no end, no way out. The woods were everywhere, pulling her in, and the creature was close. So close. She could feel its breath on the back of her neck, could hear its rasping whispers right behind her. Suddenly, the path before her opened up into a small clearing, and in the center, something gleamed in the moonlight, a faint, flickering light, almost too familiar. The altar, Olivia thought. It was the altar, the one she had seen in the very heart of the whispering woods. The light, once so blinding, had faded when she had left it, but now it pulsed softly, like a heartbeat calling to her, as if it knew she needed it. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward it, her body aching with exhaustion, but her heart full of desperate hope. She reached the altar and fell to her knees, her hands gripping the ancient stone. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please help me." And then the light flared again, blinding and bright, as the ground beneath her feet began to rumble. The darkness screamed. The light from the altar surged upwards, casting harsh beams of pale gold across the clearing. Olivia felt the warmth envelop her, the comforting glow almost pushing away the darkness that had clung to her every step. The creature's screeches faltered, its dark presence retreating into the shadows, but its hunger was still there, persistent and unrelenting. The woods had not given up, and neither had the malevolent force behind them. Her heart was hammering in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at her hands, stained with the dirt and blood from her battle, but there was no time to rest. She could feel the weight of the forest bearing down on her, and she knew she couldn't let the light fade. Not yet. The altar before her was ancient, its stone worn and cracked, covered with strange, carved symbols that glowed faintly beneath the light. Olivia didn't fully understand its significance, but in that moment, she could feel its power, like a pulse beneath the earth, a deep, primal force that had been tied to the land for centuries, perhaps even longer. The ground beneath her feet trembled again, this time with more intensity. The creature, the dark being from the woods, had not been vanquished. It had merely retreated to strike again. And when it came, it would be stronger. This place is a key, Olivia thought, her mind racing. It has to be. The light from the altar flickered, dimming slightly. Her hand instinctively reached out to touch the stone, her fingers brushing against its cold surface. There was a surge of energy beneath her fingertips, and suddenly she was not alone. The air around her crackled, and shadows danced at the edges of her vision. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, focusing on the sensation, trying to feel what the altar was telling her. There had to be a way to use its power against the woods. The whispers came again, louder now, swirling around her. You cannot change what is. You cannot escape your fate. Olivia clenched her teeth, forcing herself to ignore the voice, to drown out the temptation to surrender to the forest's call. The light from the altar seemed to pulse stronger, almost in response to her defiance, and she could feel something deep within her stir, something ancient, something connected to the land itself. And then she heard a new sound, faint but undeniable, a rhythmic thudding like a heartbeat, thumping from deep within the ground beneath her. It was slow at first, but it grew louder, faster, and soon it was vibrating through her very bones. The entire forest seemed come alive with it. She snapped her eyes open, and before her, in the center of the altar, the stone split, a crack forming down its center. The light within flared brightly, as if something was awakening from beneath. The air thickened, the energy in the clearing building to a crescendo that left her breathless. What is this? Olivia thought, fear creeping into her chest, but the need to act, to push forward, overwhelmed her. As the crack in the stone widened, a shape began to emerge from the altar, a figure, cloaked in shadows, tall and twisted, like a wraith born of the forest itself. Its form seemed to shift, melting and reforming, its features indistinct, hidden in the shifting darkness that surrounded it. The figure's eyes, however, were unmistakable. They glowed with the same malevolent fire as the creature that had chased her. Olivia's heart sank, but she forced herself to stand tall. This wasn't just some twisted being. This was the source, the heart of the whispering woods. The figure spoke, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves, a sound so hollow and empty it chilled Olivia to her core. You think you can break us? It hissed. You think you can destroy the very thing that binds this land? Olivia's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. The altar wasn't just a source of power. It was the center of the forest's curse. The force behind the woods, the malevolent entity, had anchored itself here, feeding on the souls trapped within. The light, the energy from the altar, was what had kept the darkness at bay. But now, the balance was shifting. The forest was waking again. I won't let you win, Olivia whispered through clenched teeth. The figure's laughter echoed, low and disturbing. You cannot defeat us. We are eternal. The forest has always been and will always be. The souls we've claimed, the ones you failed to save, they are ours now. And you are already part of the forest. Olivia stepped back, a chill crawling down her spine as the words resonated within her, a deep, undeniable truth. She had entered the woods, had been dragged into its grip. She had been marked. Could she ever truly leave? Was she already lost? But as she stared at the shifting figure, something stirred inside her, a flicker of the strength she had felt when she had fought back against the darkness. The light from the altar flickered again, this time in response to her thoughts. The pulse beneath her fingertips grew stronger, more insistent. The figure tilted its head, sensing her resistance. You cannot fight the inevitable, Olivia. You are already ours. The woods will consume you. But Olivia's resolve was unyielding. She wasn't going to give in. Not now. Not when she was this close to the truth. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone the woods had ever claimed. With a surge of energy, she thrust her hand into the crack in the altar, pressing against the stone as the light flared brighter and brighter, pushing against the figure before her. The creature howled in anger, but it couldn't stop the wave of power that rushed from the altar, flooding the clearing. The light blazed brighter than ever before, a searing beam that shot into the sky, cutting through the mist and shadows. The ground shook violently, and the trees around her creaked, their branches groaning under the force. The whispering woods responded with rage, its energy pushing back, but the light was stronger now, its warmth filling every corner of the forest. No, the figure screamed, its form disintegrating into a cloud of smoke, but the darkness was not gone. The roots of the trees, the shadows of the land, still reached for her, still tried to pull her back into the earth. But Olivia would not be claimed. Not now. The light flared again, and the earth beneath her feet trembled one last time. With a final, defiant push, she pulled herself away from the altar, her body bracing against the force that tried to keep her rooted in the ground. The light surged outward, a wave of pure energy, and for a moment, the forest seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Then, as the light reached its peak, everything went still. The whispers ceased. The darkness pulled back, and for the first time, Olivia felt a profound silence. The silence that followed was deafening, a heavy, suffocating pause that seemed to stretch on forever. Olivia stood at the center of the clearing, her hand still resting against the altar, her breath slow and shallow as she tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The forest, for a brief moment, had been still. The whispers, the ominous presence that had pursued her for so long, had disappeared. But Olivia knew better than to believe it was truly over. The air felt different now, lighter, as though the pressure that had weighed on her chest for so long had lifted. The trees, still towering and ancient, no longer seemed to loom over her like dark sentinels. The ground beneath her feet, once shuddering and alive with malevolent energy, now seemed stable, almost calm. She breathed in deeply, pulling the cool air into her lungs, but there was no mist, no lingering scent of decay, no sense of the forest's insidious power. For a brief, fleeting moment, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope, but that hope was quickly overshadowed by a voice. Not the whispering voices she had heard before, but something different, something colder. "You think you have won, Olivia?" The words rumbled through her mind, low and powerful, as though the very ground beneath her was speaking. It wasn't the voice of the creature she had fought. No, this was something much older, much more ancient, something far more dangerous. She spun around, her eyes scanning the clearing, but the voice was everywhere. It echoed through the trees, vibrating the very air around her. She couldn't tell where it was coming from. "You cannot break the bond. You are part of the forest now." The words were chilling, filling her with a deep, gnawing dread. Her heart skipped a beat, and her throat tightened as she realized the truth. No matter how much she had fought, no matter how much light she had invoked, she would never fully escape the woods. The altar had been a temporary solution, a brief reprieve, but the Whispering Woods had been here long before her and would remain long after. Its curse was eternal. Olivia backed away from the altar, her body tense, every muscle coiled in preparation for what was to come. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but all she could hear was that terrible voice, growing louder, angrier, more insistent. "You belong to us now. There is no escaping what we have created." She turned, her eyes wide as she searched for the source of the voice, but the woods seemed endless. They stretched out around her, a labyrinth of towering trees and shifting shadows. Every step she took felt like a step deeper into the heart of the forest, as if the land itself was pulling her in, drawing her back to its center. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted again, a low rumble reverberating through the earth, and a jagged crack split open in the clearing. It was as if the forest itself had decided to reclaim her. From the crack, thick, black tendrils of shadow emerged, writhing and twisting like living things, curling up from the earth, reaching for her legs, her arms. The darkness seemed to want to engulf her, to pull her down into the very bowels of the earth itself. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought to break free, but the tendrils wrapped around her, constricting, dragging her toward the crack. She struggled, kicking and pulling, but they held her fast. Then she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the shadows, a figure appeared, a silhouette, tall and imposing, standing in stark contrast to the swirling dark. It was a woman, cloaked in a flowing garment of silver, her face hidden beneath a hood. "You have come too far, Olivia," the woman said, her voice smooth and cold. "The forest will never let you go." Olivia's heart froze as she recognized the figure. It was the same woman she had seen in the visions, the one whose face had been obscured by the shadows, the one who had been watching her from afar, the one who seemed to hold the answers, but had never spoken. "Who are you?" Olivia demanded, her voice hoarse with fear. "What do you want from me?" The woman stepped forward, her presence unnerving in its calm, as if she knew something Olivia did not. She lifted her hood, revealing a pale face, a pair of eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. "I am the keeper of this place," the woman said softly, her voice laced with strange melancholy. "I am the one who watches over the souls of those lost in the woods. I am the one who ensures that the curse remains intact." Olivia's pulse quickened as the tendrils of shadow tightened their grip around her, dragging her ever closer to the growing chasm in the earth. You're the one who caused all of this?" The woman smiled faintly, though it wasn't a smile of comfort. "I did not cause it. I simply guard it. The Whispering Woods have existed long before me, and will exist long after I am gone. I am but a servant to its will." Olivia's eyes widened as the realization hit her like a wave. So it's true. The woods, they were never just a place. They were a force, a living, breathing thing. The woman nodded slowly. Indeed, the forest feeds on the lost, the broken, those who dare to enter its depths. It consumes them, takes their essence, and weaves it into its own. I am one of the souls bound here, though I remain more aware than most. The forest chooses its guardians, and I am its first. Olivia struggled against the tendrils, trying to break free, but they were too strong. I'm not like them. I won't be one of you. The woman's expression softened, almost pitying. You already are. You've walked its path. You've crossed its threshold. You've become part of the forest, whether you accept it or not. Tears stung Olivia's eyes as the realization dawned. The woods had already marked her, had already claimed her. She had fought it, yes, but the darkness had always been a part of her now, etched into her very being. There was no running from that truth. The woman took a step forward, her hand extended toward Olivia. It is not too late. You can still choose to embrace the forest. You can still become a part of something eternal. The woods are not as evil as you believe. They offer power, freedom, purpose. Olivia shook her head fiercely, her tears now streaming down her face. I won't let the forest win. The tendrils pulled tighter, and Olivia gasped as the chasm beneath her feet began to widen, darkness swirling in its depths, threatening to swallow her whole. But then, as she felt the overwhelming pressure build, something inside her snapped. The light, the energy from the altar, from the very heart of the forest, flared inside her once more. It surged upward, radiating from within, filling her every fiber with the power of the forest's heart. With a primal scream, Olivia wrenched herself free from the tendrils, her hands bursting with the radiant light. The shadows recoiled as the light burned through them, disintegrating the darkness with each pulse. She turned to face the woman, her voice filled with newfound strength. No, this ends now. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of shock. But before she could respond, the light from Olivia's hand surged outward, engulfing everything. The forest trembled, the trees groaning, as if they were alive, rebelling against the force Olivia had unleashed. The shadows twisted and writhed, but the light was too strong, too pure. The woman's figure flickered, her form fading as the light consumed her. And then, just like that, the darkness was gone. The whispering woods had been broken. Its hold over Olivia had been severed. For now. But as the clearing grew still once more, Olivia knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. The forest would always wait for its next opportunity, always long to reclaim its lost souls. And as for Olivia, she had become a part of it, whether she liked it or not. The light from the altar had faded, leaving only the remnants of its brilliance, a faint, lingering glow on the ground beneath Olivia's feet. The oppressive weight that had once been suffocating was gone. The trees, though still towering and ominous, no longer loomed with malevolent intent. The dark, twisting shadows that had chased her for so long had retreated, like a beast retreating into its den. But Olivia knew that the forest was never truly gone. The battle she had fought, the sacrifice she had made, had only pushed back the darkness for a time. The forest would always return. The cycle would begin again. The woman, the keeper of the forest, was gone. She had dissolved into the very air, like a wisp of smoke, leaving behind only the faintest echo of her presence. The chasm that had opened in the earth had sealed itself, leaving no trace of the horrors that had lurked beneath. The wind had stilled, and the forest seemed to exhale as if it, too, had been waiting for release. Olivia stood in the clearing, her mind whirling, her body trembling from exhaustion. She had fought so hard to survive, to escape the curse that had clung to her since her arrival. But now, standing in the aftermath of it all, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. She was different, and whether it was a change for the better or worse, she didn't know. She glanced down at her hands. They were still shaking, but now there was something more, something raw, something primal about the way she felt. The energy that surged through her, the power that had come from the heart of the forest, still lingered beneath her skin. It pulsed with life of its own, a dark and undeniable force that was now a part of her. The woods, the voice of the keeper, echoed in her mind. You have chosen your path. Olivia, you have become one with us. Olivia clenched her fists, the air around her crackling with the energy that had settled in her veins. She didn't know if she had truly chosen the path, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never be free. The forest had marked her, bound her to it, and the consequences of that would play out in ways she couldn't yet understand. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the forest around her. The trees no longer whispered to her, but their silence was just as unnerving. There was a lingering presence, as if the forest was watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. And then from the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and disheveled, his clothes torn and tattered. His eyes were wild, his face gaunt with exhaustion, and his movements were jerky, as if he hadn't quite adjusted to the world outside the forest. He stumbled toward her, his gaze locked on Olivia. "You!" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "You're still here?" Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She had seen him before, in the visions, the man who had been lost in the forest, trapped like so many others, the man who had once been part of the cursed land. You survived?" she asked, her voice shaking. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered with recognition, a flash of something dark and knowing passing through them. He took a step closer, his hand shaking, and then, in a low whisper, he said, "You'll never escape. It never ends. The woods, they never let you go." The words hit her like a wave, and she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She could see in his eyes the same torment she had felt, the same understanding of the forest's true nature, the hunger that it could never satisfy, the eternal pull that would never truly be broken. Olivia's gaze hardened. "I'm not going back. I won't let the forest claim me again." The man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was twisted, a grimace of someone who had lost hope long ago. "You don't have a choice. It owns you now. The curse, the bond is stronger than you know." His words struck at her chest, a painful reminder of the forest's power. She had felt it, hadn't she? The way it seeped into her, wormed its way into her bones. She was part of it now, as much as she hated to admit it. But there was one thing that still lingered in her mind, the altar, the light, the power she had unleashed. That had felt like a victory, hadn't it? Olivia took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You don't have to be part of it anymore. You can leave, just like I will." The man shook his head slowly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "It doesn't work like that. The woods don't let you leave. It doesn't matter how hard you fight. It doesn't matter how much light you find. Eventually, the darkness will consume you. You'll forget who you were. You'll become just another echo in the trees." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Olivia's hands clenched tighter, the energy within her surging again. But this time, it felt more dangerous, more unpredictable. "Then why are you still here?" Olivia demanded, her voice sharp. The man's eyes met hers with quiet, haunting acceptance. "Because I was never meant to leave. None of us were. And neither will you." For a moment, Olivia just stood there, the weight of his words sinking in. She could feel the force around her, the pull, the relentless pressure. It wasn't just a place. It was alive. It was a force that had claimed countless souls, weaving them into its endless web. She couldn't deny it anymore. The forest was part of her, just as much as she was part of it. And though she had won the battle, the war was far from over. "I will find a way out," she whispered to herself, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed the resolve she tried to hold on to. The man smiled faintly, as if knowing futility of her words. "We all say that at first. But you'll see. The forest always gets what it wants in the end." As the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, Olivia stood alone in the clearing. She knew he was right. The woods had claimed her. It was only a matter of time before it came for her again. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She still had questions, still had a purpose. And as long as she still had the strength to fight, she would keep pushing back. She stepped forward into the trees, the dark, silent expanse of the whispering woods surrounding her once more. She could feel its weight, its presence, creeping closer. But this time, she would not be afraid. She would find the heart of the forest, and she would destroy it once and for all. The tree let out a deafening roar, the hum faltering and then fading away entirely. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, the earth trembling as the heart of the forest. Its beating, living core shuddered and died. For a moment, there was silence. Olivia stood in the clearing, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath ragged. She had done it. She had destroyed the heart of the forest. But as she looked around, she realized that the forest was not gone. The trees still stood. The whispers still echoed faintly in the distance. The forest had not been eradicated. It had only been wounded. And in time it would heal. She wasn't free. Not yet. But for the first time, Olivia felt a spark of hope. The forest had lost its heart. And with that, it had lost its power over her. She still had a long road ahead of her. The forest would always be there, lurking in the shadows. But she would face it until the end. And this time, she wouldn't let it win. The silence that followed was suffocating. Olivia stood amidst the remnants of the forest's heart, the echoes of its roar still reverberating in the air, but now there was a haunting stillness, like the calm after a storm. Her legs shook beneath her, the energy she had unleashed leaving her physically drained, yet her mind remained sharp, every thought tinged with both triumph and an overwhelming sense of foreboding. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a quiet throb, as if the land itself was breathing in the wake of what had just transpired. But it was different now. This wasn't the rhythm of a thriving, living forest. No, this felt like the slow, painful gasp of something dying, something wounded, but not yet fully dead. Olivia's chest tightened as she surveyed the clearing. The twisted roots of the great tree were no longer alive with the dark energy they had once exuded. The blackened bark of the massive tree had cracked, fragments of it falling to the earth with hollow thuds. And yet, the air was thick, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The whispers had stopped, but something in their absence was almost worse. The silence was a void, and she could feel the weight of it pressing on her, seeping into her very bones. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting, watching. Was it over? Olivia wondered. Had I truly destroyed the heart of the forest? Her eyes darted around, seeking any sign of movement, any indication that the danger had passed. But there was nothing. The trees, once so menacing and alive with dark intent, now stood still and unervingly quiet. It was a calm before a storm, or perhaps the calm of a predator waiting to strike. A soft sound caught her attention, a rustling in the leaves, faint but unmistakable. Olivia spun around, her breath quickening, her heart pounding in her chest. From the shadowed edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. It was a man, the one she had seen before, lost in the depths of the forest. His wild eyes flickered with recognition as he stepped closer, his movements slow and cautious, as though he were afraid of disturbing the fragile stillness that had taken over the woods. He's alive, Olivia thought, her stomach twisting with unease. But how? He didn't speak at first. Instead, his eyes moved over the clearing, over the shattered remnants of the tree, over the stillness of the land, and then he fixed his gaze on her. There was a strange, sad intensity in his stare, like he knew what she had done, and more importantly, what it meant. "You've done it," he said at last, his voice raw and strained. "You've broken it." Olivia's brow furrowed. "The heart of the forest, it's gone." He nodded slowly. "But don't think for a second that it's over." His words sent a shiver down her spine, the weight of his meaning sinking in. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What do you mean?" "It's gone. I've destroyed it." The man shook his head, the edges of his smile twisted with dark humor. "You think it was just a tree? Just a beating heart?" No. Olivia, the heart of the forest wasn't just the source of its power. It was its anchor. You've severed the anchor, but you haven't destroyed the thing that holds it all together. Olivia's chest tightened. "What? The forest doesn't need a physical heart. It is the forest itself, the land, the very soul of this place that holds its power." His voice trembled slightly. "And that soul has always been bound to something much older, something much darker than you could ever imagine." Her breath hitched. "You're saying it's not over?" He stepped closer, his face grim, eyes wild with the weight of his knowledge. "No, it's just begun. The forest isn't just alive. It remembers Every soul it has consumed, every life it has stolen, is a part of its essence. And now, with the heart gone, the forest will awaken. Olivia could feel the ground beneath her feet tremble again, this time more violently. The trees groaned, and the air seemed to grow colder, thicker, as if the very atmosphere was absorbing something dark, something ancient deep within the earth. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "It remembers you, Olivia. It remembers your blood." A chill ran down her spine. She took a step back, but the man reached out, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. "No, listen. This is worse than you think." The heart was a prison, a cage for forest's true power. And now that it's broken free, it's coming for you. It's coming for all of us. Olivia yanked her arm from his grasp, her mind racing. How could this be happening? She had destroyed the heart. She had severed its grip on the forest. Why was it still stirring? Why wasn't the curse broken? The man's eyes were wide, his body trembling. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Before Olivia could speak, the ground shook beneath them with a deep, rumbling force. The trees around them bent, their trunks groaning, as if they were stretching toward the center of the clearing. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as though the very land was shifting, rearranging itself. The man stepped back, his voice trembling. "It's awake." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced around, feeling the air thicken, grow impossibly heavy. The darkness was creeping back, but now it wasn't just the trees or the shadows. It was something far worse. It was as if the entire forest had come alive, a vast, malevolent force now stretching out its tendrils toward her. And then she saw it. From the depths of the shattered trees' roots, a massive shape began to rise. It wasn't a tree, nor was it any form of life she had ever seen. It was a darkness, a writhing, inky mass of shadows, twisting and convulsing like a living nightmare. The figure that emerged was massive, towering over clearing. Its form was indistinct, a vague mass of smoke and shadow, but there was something unmistakable about it. Something ancient and full of wrath. Its presence radiated a deep, suffocating hatred that made the air feel sharp and biting. And with each movement, the ground trembled as if the very earth beneath them was cowering in fear. Olivia stepped back, her heart hammering. The whispers had returned, louder now, frantic, their voices a chaotic symphony of agony and rage. They spoke of vengeance, of the forest's hunger. And in the center of the darkness, in the center of this living nightmare, something gleamed, a pale, blood-red glow. The man gasped, his face turning pale. "The soul of the forest," he whispered. "The true heart." Olivia's eyes widened as the figure took another step, its glowing eyes fixing on her, filled with an ancient malice. It had not been destroyed. The forest had not been broken. The true heart had simply been released. And now it was coming for her. The ground beneath Olivia's feet trembled violently as the massive shadow-like figure loomed before her. It towered, its form a swirling mass of darkness, a terrifying presence so ancient and full of rage that even the trees around them seemed to bend in fear. The forest itself was alive, but now it was no longer merely a collection of sentient trees and twisted roots. It was something much more malevolent. The true heart of the forest had awakened, and its hunger was insatiable. The whispers grew louder, the voices blending into a cacophony of pain and rage, their words incomprehensible but filled with an unmistakable fury. Olivia felt the weight of them pressing on her mind, threatening to suffocate her with their endless torment. The voices spoke of ancient curses, of blood sacrifices, of endless souls lost of forest's insidious grasp. She stumbled back, trying to steady herself, but her legs were weak, her body drained from the power she had just unleashed. The darkness before her pulsed with an almost tangible hunger, a hunger that wasn't just for her. It was for everything. The forest, once a realm of whispered power, now sought domination. The soul of the forest wanted to consume all in its path. "Olivia," the man's voice broke through the noise, but his words were strained, trembling. "You've awakened it. You've released it. It's beyond anything you can control. It will consume you. It will consume us all." He was backing away, eyes wide with fear, but Olivia's mind was racing. There had to be a way to stop it. She couldn't let the forest have its way. She had come too far. She had fought too hard to let everything end like this, to let the forest reclaim the world. The glowing red eyes of the forest's true heart locked onto hers, and she felt the pull, a magnetic force, dark and powerful, drawing her closer to its terrifying center. She fought it, clenching her fists, trying to ground herself, to push against the invisible pull. The darkness stirred, shifting and coiling like smoke, eager for her surrender. I will not give in, Olivia thought, gritting her teeth, her vision swimming with the overwhelming presence of the forest's power. I can't. The man beside her, his face pale, turned and ran, his footsteps quickly swallowed by the shadows. She couldn't blame him. This force, this entity, was beyond any of them. But running wasn't an option for Olivia. She had made her choice. The forest had taken too much. She wasn't going to let it take everything else. The red light at the heart of the figure flared brighter, and the forest's presence grew stronger, more malevolent. The very air seemed to thicken with its dark power, and the ground beneath Olivia's feet cracked and shifted, as if trying to swallow her whole. The true heart was coming for her. But she wasn't going down without a fight. A memory flashed in her mind, an image of the heart of the forest, the twisted roots, the burning light she had released, the power that she had used to destroy the physical heart of the forest. That was her key. It wasn't just light. It was the energy that resided deep inside of her now, the connection she had forged with the forest, both light and dark, that had been her downfall and her salvation. She inhaled sharply, pushing herself upright. Her hands trembled, but she could feel the surge of energy within her, faint but unmistakable. She had tapped into it once before. Now she had to do it again. With every ounce of strength, she reached inside, pulling at the source of the dark power within her. The forest had tried to claim her, but it didn't own her. It didn't understand her. The power inside her was hers. She could use it to stop this. She would. The dark figure before her began to move again, tendrils of black smoke reaching out like claws. But Olivia stood firm, her arms raised to the sky, her eyes narrowing as she focused all of her energy into one single burst of light. Her body was shaking with the strain, but she could feel it, the pulse of power building, the connection to the forest itself shifting into something different. She was no longer just a part of the forest. She was more than that. She was a vessel, a force that could harness both its light and its darkness. The air crackled as her energy reached its peak. Her body glowed with a blinding light, and for a brief moment, the darkness hesitated, recoiling as if it sensed a shift in power. Olivia's heart raced in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid. This was her fight now. In one powerful motion, she released the energy. The burst of light was blinding, a flash so intense that the entire forest seemed to shake. The dark mass before her screamed in a sound that was less human and more like a collective wail of 1,000 tortured souls, but it was drowned out by the deafening roar of the light. The force of Olivia's power collided with the heart of the forest, and for a moment, everything stopped. Time itself seemed to hang suspended in the air, and the world held its breath. Then came the crash. The forest screamed in agony, the sound reverberating through the trees, the earth shuddering beneath Olivia's feet. The tendrils of darkness began to twist and writhe as the light tore through them, unraveling the heart of the forest from the inside out. The trees shook violently, their roots cracking as they were ripped from the soil, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and decaying earth. Olivia's hands burned with the intensity of the energy flowing through her, but she kept her focus, her will unwavering. The red light of the forest's true heart flickered and dimmed as her power surged, flooding the dark mass with a force stronger than the forest could withstand. With a final, guttural scream, the darkness shattered, dissolving into the air like smoke in the wind. The figure that had risen from the heart of the forest collapsed, its form crumbling into nothingness, the land around her beginning to return to stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Olivia stood in the middle of the clearing, her body trembling, her breath ragged. Her heart was pounding, her limbs weak from the battle. She had done it. The forest was defeated. The curse was broken. But as the dust settled and the trees began to settle into their place, Olivia knew something profound had changed. The forest was no longer the oppressive, malevolent force it had once been, but was still alive, still a part of the world. And so was she. The bond between them would never fully sever. But for now, she had reclaimed control. For now, she had won. But she knew deep inside that the forest would always be a part of her. And the whispers that once tormented her, they were gone. For now, the silence was deafening. Olivia stood motionless in the center of the clearing, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The air had cleared, the thick, oppressive weight that had once filled the atmosphere lifting. The whispers, the wails, the screams, all of it had ceased. The forest, now still and quiet, had returned to a semblance of peace. But she knew that it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The shattered remnants of the once mighty heart of the forest smoldered at her feet, dark smoke rising from the scorched earth. The twisted roots that had once pulsed with dark energy now lay lifeless, their former power snuffed out in the wake of the battle. But the forest, for all its apparent calm, still felt alive, watchful, waiting. She couldn't help but look up at the towering trees that surrounded her, their branches reaching high into the sky, almost as if they were trying to touch the very heavens. Their once threatening shadows were now softened, the bark no longer twisted in grotesque patterns. Yet there was something about the stillness that unnerved her, a quiet that felt too heavy, too expectant. Olivia took a step forward, her feet crunching on the dry leaves beneath her. Every movement felt slow, as if the weight of the battle still clung to her bones. She glanced down at the man who had warned her, the man who had fled in fear. He was nowhere to be seen. The tension in her chest tightened. Had he escaped? Her eyes scanned the clearing, searching for any sign of life. But the forest was eerily empty. There was no movement, no sound, not even the gentle rustle of leaves. The weight of what she had done, of what she had unleashed, pressed on her. She had destroyed the heart of the forest. But in doing so, had she truly broken the curse? Or had she simply displaced it? She took another step, her heart pounding in her chest, but her foot caught on something, a root, twisted and dark, protruding from the earth. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, as though it were waking from a long, deep sleep. The forest was stirring once more. And then she saw it. In the distance, at the edge of the clearing, a shadow flickered. It was a fleeting movement, just out of the corner of her eye, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through her. Olivia's body tensed, her senses sharpening, every instinct screaming at her to run, to get out. But she stood still, heart racing, unsure what to do next. A low growl, like the rumble of distant thunder, vibrated through the ground beneath her. The trees began to shake, their leaves trembling as though a storm was approaching. Olivia looked up, eyes wide, and saw something that made her blood run cold. At first, it was barely perceptible, a flicker of movement within the shadows, a dark figure creeping between the trees. But as it drew closer, she could see it clearly, a twisted silhouette, barely human, with jagged limbs and hollow eyes. The thing that had emerged from the heart of the forest, the force she thought she had destroyed, was back. But it wasn't the same as before. It was different now. It was no longer just a shadow, a fleeting specter. It had taken form, coalesced into something darker, more twisted. The very air seemed to warp around it, and the trees bowed under the weight of its presence. Olivia stumbled back, panic surging through her. The battle had not ended. The forest's heart had been broken, yes, but the soul of the force that had twisted it all, was not so easily destroyed. The figure took another step, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was like a marionette, strings pulled by something far more ancient than any of them. Olivia's heart thudded in her chest as the realization struck her. The heart of the forest hadn't been its true core. It had been a vessel, a prison that kept the darkness contained. By destroying it, she had freed the entity that had been trapped for centuries. Now it had a new form, a new body, and it was more powerful than ever. The thing reached out, its elongated hand scraping the earth as it moved closer to her. Olivia could feel the pull of its darkness, an overwhelming wave of malice that threatened to swallow her whole. But she couldn't run. She had no time. The forest had won once more. She clenched her fists, gathering the last of her strength. She could feel the power of the forest pulsing through her, its final remnants swirling in her veins. It was almost as if the forest was calling to her, asking her to join it. asking her to give in. "But I will not." She refused. She couldn't. As the figure drew nearer, Olivia stepped forward, her eyes locked onto its hollow gaze. The thing moved with a slow, deliberate pace, its form shifting, ever-changing, as if it were constantly adjusting to the darkness that powered it. With a roar, the entity lunged toward her. In that moment, everything around her seemed to explode into chaos. The trees groaned, the earth cracked beneath her, and the air grew thick with the force of the darkness closing in. But Olivia didn't falter. She focused all the energy within her, drawing on every ounce of power the forest had given her, every shred of resistance she had left. She would not let this happen. She would not let the forest win. With a cry, she thrust her hands forward, releasing the final burst of energy she had. The light blazed brighter than ever before, a wave of pure energy colliding with the twisted figure in front of her. It screamed in agony as the light engulfed it, the darkness recoiling from the force of Olivia's power. The ground trembled violently, the forest shaking as the light clashed with the shadows. The air seemed to fracture, a brilliant, blinding glow overwhelming the land. Olivia could feel the forest reacting, the roots, the trees, the earth itself responding to her. And then everything stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the oppressive weight of silence, as if the world had held its breath and was waiting for the outcome. Olivia stood there, trembling, gasping for breath, her hands still raised, the last vestiges of light flickering around her. The dark figure that had haunted her was gone. Its form, its essence, vanished into ether. And the forest? It, too, was still. The trees, no longer riding with malice, stood tall and proud. The air, once thick with dark power, was now clear. The forest had been cleansed, its heart broken, its soul freed. But at what cost? Olivia looked around, the weight of what she had done settling in. The forest had been a prison, a curse, a force of malevolent power. But in freeing it, she had unleashed something even more dangerous, the forest's true power. And she had barely survived. She turned and walked away from the clearing, her steps slow, each one heavier than the last. The forest no longer felt like a monster lurking in the shadows. But she knew one truth now. This would never truly be over. The darkness may have been defeated, but the forest would always remain a part of her, and it would always haunt her dreams. The end. The battle for the heart of the forest is over, but Olivia's journey has left her forever changed. She walks away from the forest, but the shadows linger, always watching, always waiting.